On your Friday episode of Locked On Raptors, we've gone through the best and worst case scenarios for all the players on the team, but what about the team itself? Is there a chance they sneak into the top 8? Could they be as bad as the Pistons? It's all possible, baby. We're going to get into the best and worst case scenarios for your Toronto Raptors with our pal Joe Wolfond from The Score. Thanks for hanging.
You are Locked On Raptors, your daily Toronto Raptors podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's going on? And welcome to another episode of Locked On Raptors, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every damn day. It is Friday, September the 13th. Ooh, spooky. And I'm your host, Sean Woodley. I've been covering the Toronto Raptors now for 10 seasons on various platforms, almost 11 seasons. I'm very old. Of course, you can find me over on the Hell website at Woodley Sean. You can find the show on Instagram at Locked On Raptors. And of course, join us in the place to be, which is the Locked On Raptors Discord server. Link in the description of the podcast. Free to join as always. Come be part of our little family of sickos over there on the Discord. A reminder, of course, support the show on the audio or video platform of your choice. Do it on both. For all I care, it's much appreciated however you choose to support the podcast. Thanks in advance for doing so. And today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket with YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And we will get started here on your best case, worst case for the team itself, the Toronto Raptors of 2024-25. What range of outcomes are we looking at here for a team that doesn't figure to be all that good, but could be interesting in a way last year's team certainly was not? And here to dig into those various outcomes is our dear pal, formerly of Pound the Rock, tear rolling down my face. It is Joe Wolfond from The Score. Joe, lovely to have you back, my friend. How are you?
I'm good. It's lovely to be back. It's been a minute. In the best case, worst case spectrum of my day, coming on here lands on the positive end of the ledger. So thanks for having me on.
That is all we can ask for over here. We're going to get into how bad things could get, what our most likely sort of general prediction for the team this season is going to be. But let's start off, as we have throughout this series of shows, on the positive end of things. Feeling good, looking optimistic. And I do think there's a world in which these Raptors are better than they're projected to be. Maybe not a whole lot better, because the Eastern Conference feels pretty entrenched when it comes to the top 8, maybe even the top 9, depending on how you feel about the Atlanta Hawks. And so there's only so much upward mobility this team might have. But I do think just the cloud of uncertainty and terrible vibes from last season being gone and cleared away, a team that actually kind of makes some basketball sense, at least within the starting 5, and plenty of room for internal growth from guys like Scottie Barnes, Grady Dick, Immanuel Quickley, even RJ Barrett, maybe a rookie or two pops. Like, I do think there's a world in which this is not a depressing ass Toronto Raptors season, where they actually go out, play some interesting ball, maybe aren't super duper competitive, against the very best teams, but pick up some wins along the way, and you feel pretty good about where they sit, kind of regardless of where they end up in the standings. What is your best case vision for this year's Raptors team, Joe? I give you the floor.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think right off the jump, it should be easy to avoid a depressing season just because there aren't any expectations. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for every Raptors fan and what they're expecting out of this season, but I think generally the vibe is, let's see what we have. And I think that is, in a lot of ways, what we didn't get to see last year. Like, I think we got to see a pretty significant leap from Scottie Barnes. Like, that was the most important story, I would say, from that lost season. But then it's like, did we learn a lot about Darko Rajakovic? I think we learned a lot about his offensive philosophy, but there was so much turnover and so much turmoil and change. Like, how much did we really learn about what kind of a coach he is? And it's like they remake the team when they ship out OG Anunoby. Then 3 weeks later, they trade Pascal Siakam. A month after that is a trade deadline and more changes happen. Then there's injuries upon injuries. And there was just no consistency about, who was actually on the floor for this team. So I think it made it very difficult to actually get a sense of what this is building toward. Apart from the fact that, okay, we know Scottie is a cornerstone. The contract they just gave Immanuel Quickley makes it pretty clear that they view him as a cornerstone as well. Is RJ Barrett one of those pillars? I think we'll find out. Is Jakob Poeltl part of the long-term vision? I think we'll find out. To what extent can Grady Dick ascend and become one of those cornerstones? I think there's a lot to still learn about this team. And that's what makes it kind of exciting to me. I'm not expecting them to be especially good, but I think that can still turn out to be like a kind of fun and interesting season. Now, there's definitely a universe in which progression doesn't happen, growth stagnates for some key players. And that's where maybe things could take a bit of a dour turn where it's like, okay, what are we actually doing here? Mm-hmm. But I think given the youth and I would say more synergistic skill sets of the key players on the roster, I think it's more likely that we see a team that is mediocre to bad, but maybe showing signs of moving in a more positive direction.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. And honestly, when I'm kind of thinking about the best and worst case outcome for the team, I'm not really going to record at all when I'm thinking about it. I'm mostly thinking about like, what are the guys who matter most doing when they're on the floor together, or when a couple of them are on the floor together, and are they able to put together winning minutes in a season where they're probably going to lose a lot of minutes, but are there stretches where the guys who matter most are doing things that perhaps portend winning more minutes in years to come? And that to me is sort of the bellwether for success for me for this team. It's not, the difference between 29 and 38 wins. It's the difference between RJ, Scottie, and Immanuel Quickley having a negative net rating as a trio versus an interesting and kind of promising positive one, right? Like that is kind of where I'm looking at as far as deeming this a success or a best case outcome season. Of course, if all those things happen and they are a positive trio, or, Grady Dick takes a bit of a leap, Jakob Poeltl has a bit of a bounce back playing on a team that makes sense for Jakob Poeltl, the wins will be there, and they'll probably flirt with a record that, hits Vegas overs and maybe kind of in a conversation for, a home play-in game or something like that if everything breaks super right. But I don't think looking at this season through the lens of wins and losses is really the way to do it with this year. It's just a different kind of team. I guess to me, there's the sort of one number from last year that I kind of look at and say, there's a reason for some hope. It's a tiny sample, but it's what the starters did with Gary Trent Jr. In like the 10 games they played together in February, mostly. They were a plus 12 net rating overall, pretty passable on defense, very good on offense. You move Grady Dick into that spot in place of Gary Trent Jr., we presume. We're not sure just yet exactly who's starting, but it seems like it's pointing towards Grady Dick. Do you have belief that that group in particular can replicate some of the success we saw, again, albeit in a small sample last year, and that can be sort of the driving force for good vibes and positive feelings this season?
Not to the extent that they're going to be a plus 12 in a larger sample against, quality competition. But yeah, I think that is right now where any semblance of optimism and hope ought to lie, is like, you know as well as anybody how high I was on Immanuel Quickley. And I think most of that kind of bore out after the trade. I think there were some things that maybe took a little bit of the shine off of him, for me at least, after he came over and was kind of thrust into that lead guard role. But I think there are also a lot of caveats there where it's like he's playing a role that basically he's never played before, being asked
passing to Malik Williams a lot.
Yeah, exactly. I think what was maybe most concerning on that front was just, I don't think him and Scottie developed any kind of synergy whatsoever. And that's obviously going to be imperative if they're going to be these two cornerstones of the rebuild or retool or whatever you want to call it. The other one there was just like the fact that he struggled to get all the way to the rim, was really kind of like aborting his drives, killing his dribble way too early. I think we actually saw a lot of progress on that front He was at 13% rim frequency before the All-Star break, 21% after that. And, having asked Darko about that specifically, he said like that was a point of emphasis for them with his development. So I think that can be read as an encouraging sign. And then, to me, the biggest sort of mystery box is RJ Barrett, because he was just a completely different player in the 32 games that he played for the Raptors than he had been really at any point in his career up to that point. He was at 57% finishing at the rim with the Knicks during the season up until the trade, 72% after that. Went from shooting 33% from three-point range to 39%. Just a ridiculous transformation on that front. I think his playmaking was as good as I had ever seen it be. And how real is that? How replicable is that? Like, he talked about just how he felt like he was a good fit with Darko's sort of free-flowing, up-tempo offensive system, which was a change from the more static and slower system he was playing in New York. I can buy that to a certain extent, but I think there's still a long way to go for him to sort of prove that was real, that is the RJ Barrett that we're going to get moving forward. The Olympics, to me, were like a great indicator on that front. I think he was fantastic in Paris. So that's the one where I'm like, what is he going to be? Because if he is that guy that he was post-trade, I think that really changes the outlook for this team and what it can be, because that takes him basically from being, kind of a square peg in a round hole trying to fit with the rest of that starting five into one that I actually think fits very nicely between Quickley and Scottie on the wing. I haven't mentioned Grady Dick, but like, he should be the fifth starter, right? I think there's that should just be a no-brainer. Even if you don't think that is what is going to bring the most immediate success to this team, looking at that big picture, thinking long-term, he needs those reps. Like, you want to see, can he hang as a starter? How does he fit with the rest of these guys? I think he should be in there from day one.
Yeah, man. I think the starters are going to be an interesting watch all season long. The RJ thing, I think, is fascinating. Like, is he the baseball player who makes a swing change and becomes incredible and like it's just going to stick, or is it a small sample flourish of really good play in the midst of a career of being RJ Barrett? I think a lot of interesting questions in that starting five. If they all work out great though, and everything kind of goes the way you want it to go, I think you're looking at something that feels that warms your heart a little bit at night, even as the Raptors, perhaps, as you mentioned, putter along without winning many games. We're going to get into the sort of high upside in the playoff standings and all of that coming up later on. But I do want to get into how bad things could get if things don't go exactly as planned. We'll get into the dark underbelly of what the season could be coming up in just one sec. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, the #1 sportsbook in North America. And this week, or the next few weeks, we've got something a little bit different for you over there at FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. That's a big deal. 3 weeks, that's a big chunk of the season. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. And if that's not enough, be sure to check out FanDuel's Profit Boost in the app and use it for FanDuel's Double Your Winnings for all of Sunday, September the 15th. Pre-game moneyline bets. Profit Boost will be live starting Thursday on the 12th. So that's today or yesterday. You're listening to this on Friday. So view your account page now and learn more about your boost. Visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. Back out here with Joe Wolfond, getting into the worst case outcomes for the Toronto Raptors should they come to pass this coming season. And look, we could say Jakob Poeltl and Scottie Barnes get hurt again. That feels like a cop-out. Yeah, if those guys get hurt, they're screwed because they're very important to them playing functional basketball. 4-28 without Jakob Poeltl last season. Not an accident, as you alluded to earlier, Joe. But like, outside of the Yak and Scottie injury of it all, what are some things that give you some pause that maybe could indicate that a worst case scenario is happening? And what does a worst case outcome look like for you for the Raptors this season?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're just talking about results, probably a couple things to look at are 3-point volume. Like, I have real concerns about whether this team's going to be able to just get enough 3-pointers up. That's a big, look at Grady Dick, right? Like, a big reason that he needs to be in the starting lineup, I think, and something that he needs to be focusing on. As much as I'm like, I don't care about the bad shooting in summer league, whatever. I'm looking at all this other in-between stuff that I feel like he could really develop. He needs to get threes up. Like, you look at the starting lineup, and yeah, RJ shot the three well after coming over in the trade, but he's at like 4 threes per 36 minutes, like not super high volume. Quickley, we know, is going to get them up. Like, that is a huge part of what he is here to do.
10 a game, baby. 10 a game. Yeah.
No, seriously. Like, that's what they need from him. And then they need Grady to be getting them up as well. Because you look, like, Scottie made some strides as a 3-point shooter last year, but I don't even think you want him to be high volume 3-point shooter. Like, that's not what he's there to do. Obviously, Yak isn't going to shoot them. So, that's what they need from Dick in the starting lineup. And then, I mean, even like looking at the bench, it's like, Olynyk will shoot a couple a game. Bruce Brown will shoot a couple a game, but it's not, I just don't think this team is really set up to shoot a lot of threes. And I don't think they're set up to shoot them especially well. I don't think they're going to be terrible, but it's like probably going to be in like nearish the bottom 5 in 3-point volume and maybe like middle of the pack in 3-point percentage. So that right there is like an immediate limiting factor, I think, on offense. And as much as I think the pieces are better equipped to execute Darko's offensive system than they were at the start of last year, it's still not ideal in terms of being able to like move the defense with the amount of shooting that you can put on the floor. So that's one concern. And then, you look at the other end of the floor and it's like, this team finished 26th in defensive efficiency last year. And they were 29th after the OG Anunoby trade. And again, that had a lot to do with the injuries, Yak going down, Scottie going down, probably the two most important defenders on the team, not there. So I give them a bit of a pass on that, but like 26th is 26th. Like, they need to be better than that. And I think, another thing that I asked Darko about at his end of season availability was like, I think we all got a clear sense of what your offensive philosophy is, but like, what is your defensive philosophy? And he had admitted basically he felt with all the changes, all the moving parts and like the roster overhaul, he found it was a lot easier to sort of like imprint his offensive philosophy on the team than a defensive philosophy, because there was just not enough familiarity. It makes it difficult for guys to be on the same page and communicate. And he seemed pretty optimistic that we were going to get a sense of what that defensive philosophy was this year. So, you can be optimistic about that, but also looking at the team, it's like, I mean, I think Quickley as sort of like a team defender is actually very good, but on the ball, he was rough last year. RJ, the thing with RJ is like, you look at his body, his physical proportions, his sort of, athletic tools, and you think he ought to be a much better defender than he is. But he also, I don't know if that's true. Like, I just don't know if he has the kind of lateral explosiveness that would allow him, especially as an on-ball guy, to be like a A1 type of stopper. So I think, if he can settle in as like an average on-ball guy, but like improve as an off-ball defender, like that's where I think he has the most room to grow. Because maybe he just doesn't have the type of athleticism that translates well to on-ball defense. But with reps and with maybe a better understanding of system, I think you could get to a point where he is an impactful help defender. And that's what I want to see more so from him. And then what Yak is going to be able to do on the back line. Really good rim protector, really smart defender, fairly scheme versatile. Scottie, we saw, I think, he to me, before the injury, was like one of the most improved defenders in the entire NBA. A lot of that also came as sort of like a low man, backside help, those type of situations.
Event creation, baby.
Yeah. So again, I'm like thinking, what's going to undo this team? What's going to lead to bad results? It's like lack of 3-point shooting at the offensive end, and then leakiness at the defensive end. And I'm I think there are reasons to believe that at least defensively they can be a lot better than they were last year. Davion Mitchell is here now.
Yep.
And so, a big question to me is like, how playable is he offensively? Like, can he do enough at that end to stay on the floor so that his defense can make an impact? Because I think he arrives like immediately as the team's best point of attack defender.
Yeah.
And
mine is just outside of maybe Jamal Shed, who's a freak. But he's also
true. But like, Mitchell has a little more size than Jamal Shed, and I think has proven it more, I guess, over a number of years. So, but yeah, that's again like a couple of guys who are not going to be in the starting mix, but who, let's say you're trying to put a closing lineup together, and there's just like an opposing player who you need to shadow and lock down in crunch time. Can that be Davion Mitchell? And then you're not completely giving all of it back at the offensive end of the floor, right? Like I think there are avenues towards solutions to some of these problems, but it's all very tenuous to me. And so figuring out what's going to work, I guess, at both ends of the floor is going to be a challenge. And there's going to have to be some kind of juggling act that finds the right balance. And I think that's, I guess if we're zooming out and looking at this issue broadly, it's like, are you able to synergize your best offensive and defensive lineups in any kind of feasible way?
No, that's well put. I think I'm more worried about the bottom falling out of the defense than the offense, just because of, I have my reservations about RJ on defense in particular. I think the sort of, you hit on it, the strangeness of his athletic profile, the fact that when he's moving downhill with the ball in his hands, dudes just kind of bounce off of him and he looks like this athletic marvel. I wonder if it's just that the lateral stuff, the tracking backwards when defending a guy, that stuff just is not as natural to him or whatever, but he can't really stay in his spot. Like he loses his spot a lot to guys who just kind of nudge him out of the way. That's a real concern, because if you're looking at RJ Barrett as like a negative wing defender, you're forced to play Scottie Barnes in that spot and hope he can succeed more than he has in the past. Then you're pulling him out of the place he's most successful. And there's all these sort of cascading effects. I have real concerns about the defense. That said, I think the offense has a chance to be maybe not like a lead or anything like that, but bordering on good if things really kind of hit here. I could totally hear the concerns about 3-point volume. After January 1st last year, they were 24th in 3-point volume. They were not good at hitting them either, of course. That was a very bad basketball team. But I do think there's something to the idea of Darko's philosophy gets good shots. They were 7th in location effective field goal percentage after January 1st last year. Very good. For those who don't know what that stat means, basically, what an average team would shoot from the places that the Raptors shot. The Raptors were 21st in effective field goal percentage, despite that top 10 mark in terms of location effective field goal percentage. So they're getting the right shots. They didn't have the talent to actually hit the shots last year. I think a big part of that was the talent was not available for 20 games of that stretch. And we should see a bit of an increase there. And they're clearly a good rim pressure team that prioritizes it too. They were 4th in rim frequency after the January 1st, like the OG trade, essentially. There's some Pascal Siakam stuff mixed in there too. But in general, really good.
That's the RJ effect though. Like
totally, 100%. And I think there's like an element too that like Quickley and Pirtle didn't get to tap a lot into their pick and roll chemistry. And I think there's like rim shots to be gained from that duo working in tandem as well. And obviously the Scottie Quickley stuff still has plenty of ground to cover too in terms of creating that synergy you talked about. But I do think just because they're playing offense in a way that's getting to pretty decent spots, at least around the rim, I think you can leverage that into higher 3-point volume. I think Quickley in particular showed a little bit of interesting dynamism as like a drive and kick guy last year. If he's getting paint touches, I think that's going to just sort of lead to higher volume. And same with Scottie, right? Like I think if Scottie's drawn too, and that there's other guys to worry about, and Grady Dick's flying around doing off-ball actions, like that's going to create extra looks out of those paint touches that they prioritize. So I feel good about the offense being sort of perhaps even in the upper half of the league. I think the defense has a chance to be bottom 2 or 3 if like some serious improvements aren't made. And that's what leads to your worst case outcome when it comes to record and where you line up in the standings. We'll come back, Joe. We'll get into the standings. We'll get into where we actually think we haven't really talked about that, the best and worst case outcomes here. But we'll get into sort of the high and low end of where they might finish to close things out, what we actually think is going to happen with the Raptors this coming season. We'll do that coming up in just one sec. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at BetterHelp. And look, it's a time of year where your kids are back at school, and it can also be a time for you to prioritize learning new skills as well. Maybe you want to pick up a new language. Maybe you want to get into gardening. Maybe you want to do some construction projects around your house, but you just don't have the tools or know-how. It's never too late to start learning and prioritizing the things that are going to make you happy in your life. And therapy can help you get back to feeling like you have a sense of wonder, get back to feeling like you want to go and learn things and add them to your day to day. And again, having a therapist to talk to those things, help you prioritize the things that are going to make you happy in your life. It's a very nice thing. I know a lot of people who have really benefited from therapy. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Back at it here with Joe Wolfond, and we're going to now talk about standings and win totals and stuff. It's something we've not really covered so far in this best and worst case scenario show about your upcoming 24-25 Toronto Raptors, but let's get into it here. Let's start on the high end. Like, just kind of top of dome, thinking about the way the Eastern Conference is set up. I mentioned off the top, it feels like the top 8 is entrenched. The Heat feel maybe a little wobbly on account of their old and attrition, and it can't keep on going like this forever, can it? You have the Hawks and the Hornets, who I think are kind of in the bucket the Raptors are in that sort of back end of the play-in race. Too good to truly be tankers, but maybe not good enough to punch into the top 8, but maybe they are. What do you think, just sort of win total and place in the standings, is the absolute peak the Raptors can hit this year, Joe?
I'm going to say like 42 wins. Like, does that seem about right or too optimistic? Like, I think there's a universe in which Scottie takes another step forward. I mean, that's the big one to me.
Yeah.
Like, that's what all of this is banking on. So can he make some more refinements in terms of, his pick and roll craft, his ability as a ball handler, a self-creator, a little bit more of that sort of, fluidity when it comes to maybe getting to a pull-up mid-ranger, the kind of things that can make him more dangerous as a pick and roll operator, whether it's running, like some 4-5 stuff with Pirtle, whether it's running inverted stuff with IQ. I mentioned, like, I think those two guys being able to, like, figure out their two-man chemistry is, like, imperative. But if that happens, like, there's no reason in terms of the skill sets, but, the respective sizes of the two players, like, that should be a very dynamic two-man game. So, yeah, I think there's a universe in which, like you mentioned, they could be in the top half in offensive rating in the league. And then there, again, the question marks maybe will come at the defensive end of the floor, but I think there is at least enough talent overall defensively. Again, it's like maybe not enough of like the on-ball defense, and it's like you got a bunch of guys who are pretty good off-ball defenders, but who's actually guarding the ball. But I think there's a universe in which they could be something like, maybe close to league average on that front, and then you're looking at like a 500 team. So I think they could get there in a best case scenario, like 42 wins, and they're an 8 seed, playing play-in games. Is that what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's crazy. I think 42 is probably a little higher, like 2 wins higher. I think 40 was kind of where I was going to go with my high end, just because I think the league is really good, and it's going to be hard to amass all sorts of wins, just because, like, outside of 5 or 6 teams every night, the Raptors are probably going to be favored to lose. But yeah, like, if the offense really hits and that the sort of star stuff happens with Scottie, where he's driving winning minutes whenever he's on the floor, then yeah, like, they're probably going to walk into a lot more wins than it feels like they can right now. And yeah, like, we always go into every year and be like, oh, well, those teams are entrenched. Those teams are going nowhere. And then someone always falls out. Someone hits an injury. Maybe multiple teams hit injuries. attrition, age, Jimmy Butler going nuts, like, all kinds of things could befall the teams that theoretically are ahead of them in the standings. And while I'd pick the Hawks as the more likely team to fill the vacancy if one of those top 8 teams falls out, I don't think the Hawks are some world beaters or anything like that. And so, yeah, like I do think 8th seed is probably the high end of what they're capable of this year. And if they do that, I think that's a pretty exciting place to kind of jump off into next season, right? That said, there will be the sort of the draft heads who are mad that the Toronto Raptors made the play-in. I don't think the worst case scenario even has them in the place of the Pistons or the Wizards or the Nets in terms of badness. I think their probable low end is probably like 12th in the East if things go really, really poorly here. I think the Bulls are going to be hot ass. Like I think the bottom of the East is exceptionally bad, and it's going to take one of those big long-term injuries or multiple big long-term injuries for the Raptors to really stoop to that level. But is it that in their best interest, Joe? Is it actually better if the Raptors stumble down and end up in that 12-13 range of the East and are higher in the lottery in terms of like the long-term vision here? Or would the atrophy that comes with a season that is that bad ultimately sort of outweigh any positives you get from whoever you might draft?
I mean, I think context is everything on that front. Like, I'm not saying there's not a situation where that atrophy could set in and you build losing habits and, you're sort of punting a season for the sake of like a lottery ticket that might not pan out. But by all accounts, is a really strong draft class. I think going into the season, like I said off the top, this is just about finding out what you have. So from the jump, I don't think the idea should be about squeezing every last drop you can out of this roster, squeezing every last win that you can in the way that Nick Nurse did in his last couple of years at the helm, because that's not the way that this team is built. So I think immediately the philosophy should be like, you're not trying to lose games, but you're also in more of like fact-finding mode than you are in let's try to win every possible game that we can so we can, host a play-in game or whatever.
Right.
So from that perspective, I think you're going into the season from a position of, this is about collecting data. And that puts you in a spot where, you're not necessarily going to maximize the full potential of the roster as it is. To your point, I don't think, on paper, they're not nearly bad enough to compete with like the real tankers of the league. But, like I said about Pirtle, right? Like does there come a point mid-season where you're like, well, we're on track to finish like 11th in the East. Does it make sense to maybe, like Bruce Brown is probably going to go in that situation regardless. I don't really see a scenario where he finishes the season with the team no matter what. So like he's probably out the door. Then maybe is there a window to trade Pirtle, and can that sort of better set you up for the future in terms of what you bring back in a trade like that? And then also propelling a nosedive in the standings that is going to help secure better lottery position. Like getting out from under that commitment to San Antonio kind of gives them an opportunity this year if that's the direction that they decide to go. And that opportunity wasn't necessarily there for them last year. Like things kind of, if you were looking to keep last year's pick, which we don't have to relitigate that, like whatever, that happened, it's out the door. But if that was your goal, then actually things went exactly the way that you would have wanted last year, because you actually did get all of these really encouraging signs from Scottie and a couple of the other young guys on the team, but the team was still bad enough to get you into, a place where you were maybe in, I think they finished 6th in lottery positioning by the end of the season, right? So
I think it was 7th, but yeah.
7th. So that's, like that kind of went the way that you would have wanted it to, but they had that commitment hanging over their heads, and now they don't. And so if things go similarly, where there are injuries, where they see an opportunity to make, a trade that improves their lottery odds in 2025, I think that's something they're going to have to seriously consider, just given where the franchise is right now.
Yeah, I struggle with the Yacht thing because I do think you trade Pirtle, and that's where the atrophy can really set in, especially if you don't have like an actual plan to replace him, because he's important to playing meaningful basketball for a lot of these guys and facilitating their development. And so I think you have to have like a no doubt succession plan in mind if you're going to do that. And that succession plan cannot be sign Christian Coloco for the 1,000th time, YouTube commenters. There's got to be an actual plan there. And so for me, like, if I'm thinking most likely outcomes here, I do think they probably end up doing some sort of sell-off at the deadline. Bruce Brown. I think Kelly Olynyk's actually a really interesting candidate. If he plays well, you get to the deadline and maybe the Warriors come calling again or something like that. Like, I think he's someone who, if he's in good form, could be someone you move off of to kind of get off that commitment for next season and not feel like you're sapping the core elements of the team that are giving you the most positivity, which I expect Jakob Poeltl is going to be party to this year with that starting five we talked about. Mm-hmm. And so if they're going into the deadline kind of in that 9, 10, 11 range, I think we see them probably sell off a couple guys, give rookies a shot to play a little bit more, and probably don't lose to the same extent they did down the stretch last year, but lose enough to kind of get into that back end of the top 10 range, like kind of do a Jazz thing basically. And they kind of are all right with the lottery odds being what they are from those positions in a flattened lottery world, where in recent history, they've won the lottery from the 7th spot and other teams have won the lottery from that range as well. I think that's probably the most likely outcome here. And we see them win like 33 games or something like that. Is that kind of the range you're looking at too, as far as just like where they're most likely to finish up win total wise?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think barring a significant sell-off, and I would consider like trading Poeltl. That's what removing a significant piece. So
totally, 100%.
Barring something like that, I don't think the floor of this team is like super duper low. I think, something like 31-ish wins is like where they would bottom out if things really didn't click. I do think, given everything that happened last year, how miserable a slog that was, there's something to be said for just being a reasonably decent young team that can maybe offer a promise of something better down the road.
Yeah, I think that is ultimately what they will probably end up doing. The shape of that we still have to see. We have a lot of time between now and the start of the season still to get into that, and we will continue examining that starting next week when we get back to daily episodes, baby. Yeah, that's right. The 3-a-week schedule is done. We're going back to daily next week. Before we do that, though, we got to sign off this show. Joe, thanks so much for being here, man. It was a pleasure as always. You have anything you want to promote for the good people out there?
I mean, as always, my writing is at The Score right now. Me and Joe Cash are doing a kind of season preview series. We're running through all of the players that we deem to be the most interesting for the coming season, so you can check those out. I also had, this is from a few weeks ago, but still pertinent, and like especially pertinent to this discussion. But I wrote a piece about the Raptors and sort of where all of this is going and the calamity of last season and what, if anything, can be learned from it. So again, that's a few weeks old, but like, I don't think anything has really changed. So if you're interested, you can check that out.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for hanging out. We will talk to you again on Mondays. We return to daily here on the pod. I think our pal Big V's back from Peru by then too, which is very exciting. We'll talk to you again next week. Thanks so much for hanging out. Bye-bye. Oh.